This week, we'll be looking at gender differences in intelligence, which is obviously a hot topic. Everyone would like to think either that their gender is the smarter one or that there are no gender differences at all on any cognitive abilities. And of course, it's never that straightforward. I think the most important point for you to take away from this lecture is just how very important culture and socialization are when it comes to looking at differences in intelligence or cognitive abilities. At first, that might sound somewhat strange. Surely intelligence is hardwired or inherited or determined by genes, right? And yes, part of that is true. We know that some degree of intelligence is inherited, and some people are gifted right from birth while others struggle with certain disabilities. But we also know that enriched environments can make it easier for children to learn and to attain a higher IQ later in life. But when it comes to talking about men versus women, well, that's where the environment really makes a difference. Because there's nothing profoundly different about men's and women's brains. Sure, there are some minor differences, but nothing that overwhelmingly would make men smarter. And let's acknowledge that fact right now. It's almost always about men being smarter. Why? Because since practically the dawn of time, work, which required intelligence, was the man's job, and staying at home looking after babies and doing housework and cooking and all that, which surely didn't require much intelligence, those were the women's jobs. And so men were seen as smarter. But the women weren't given the same educational opportunities as the men back then, so it was no big surprise that men were seen as smarter. We'd like to think that now we give the exact same educational opportunities to men and women, to boys and girls, but as you'll find out through the lecture and watching the linked videos, this isn't always the case. We still live in a culture where math is largely a male subject, and this has a tremendous impact on young girls' and women's educational aspirations, as STEM careers rely heavily on a strong background in math. And on top of this, we encourage young boys to play in a way that helps them develop necessary skills for STEM careers. Things like building towers of blocks or playing spatially oriented video games. So we end up with a lot of differential gender socialization when it comes to math education, which results in many STEM fields being highly biased towards men. And you'll see how we end up with similar biases regarding women's verbal abilities. It isn't all biological, folks. There are clear ways that culture and socialization lead to adult men and adult women having different intellectual strengths. So when someone starts talking about how men are just naturally better than women at math, or how women's brains are hardwired to be better at language, you'll know better than to be fooled into thinking that these differences are entirely biological. And you'll also know that some of the claims are not entirely true either. Some of these facts are actually quite misleading. Week 10, Chapter 9. So this is where the material gets really fun for me, when we start talking about interpersonal relationships, love, and sex. I definitely find a lot of the other material interesting, but this is the fun stuff for me. It's what I love researching and studying and talking to with just about anyone who will listen. And I hope that you'll find this material fun too. It's especially likely that this material will relate to you in your lives right now. So this week's material is all about friendship and love. And you probably already know a lot about what we're going to cover when it comes to friendship, because it does support some pretty powerful stereotypes we have about men's and women's relationships. Throughout the lecture, you'll see repeated over and over again, and at every age group, that men and boys are more likely to do things with their friends and prioritize activities, and women and girls are more likely to just talk with their friends and prioritize emotional closeness. This is one of those stereotypes that is supported by actual research. But what I want you to remember is that it doesn't mean it's entirely biological. Society and culture play a huge role here. Remember how we covered how little girls are encouraged to talk more, especially about their feelings, than little boys, and how people talk more to little girls than to little boys? Well, it's not surprising that little girls end up talking and sharing more and enjoying it more, as it's something they're reinforced for. And ultimately, that means you end up with adult women who enjoy talking and sharing more in their friendships. In addition, little girls are encouraged to practice relationships. They play house, they play with dolls. But there's likely something biological going on as well. I don't mean to imply that it's 100% nurture. I just want you to remember that both biology and environment play a role in almost every gender difference. Sometimes the role of biology will be more significant, sometimes the role of the environment will be more significant, but it's rarely just one or the other. And it's important to continually remind ourselves of that so we don't fall into patterns of just assuming that's how it's supposed to be, or that's how it'll always be. As a parent, this is a particularly important reminder, as I'm aware of how easy it is to just default to the status quo and how things have always been, and how it's easier to just buy trains and blocks and call it a day and not encourage my son to try playing house or to talk about his feelings. I will say we do a lot of the latter, talking about feelings, but since he's never shown any interest at all in playing with even the little Duplo people that come with his block sets, I'm not holding out much hope for him suddenly wanting to play house. Week 11, Chapter 10. Do you know what's sometimes very difficult but very cool? Being a sex researcher. I love what I study, primarily sexual satisfaction, sexual intimacy, and sexual self-disclosure. But a lot of people think these topics are better left unstudied. They're too private, they're too personal. And what kind of weirdo pervert are you for trying to get people to tell you how much they masturbate, or whether they orgasm regularly, or how satisfied they are with their casual sex partner? But the thing is, knowledge is useful, especially when it comes to things that are so private and personal that they often aren't talked about very much with close friends or even one's own sexual partner. And even more so when these private, personal things are so important to us. Very few people would happily forego all sexual contact for the rest of their life. Why not? Well, because we're driven to experience affection and closeness with others. We're driven to seek sexual satisfaction. We're sexual beings. And not knowing about how sex works or what works for which people or which people have which sexual problems, that's a problem. So you're going to watch some videos and read about some of the earliest sexuality researchers who were trying to answer these questions and others at a much more conservative time in history, when homosexuality was still considered a mental disorder and premarital sex was completely unacceptable. These researchers were absolutely pioneers, and they faced considerable difficulties while trying to study the things they thought were important. And there are still pioneers today studying difficult topics that again seem too personal or too sensitive for many people in the public, and even for some other researchers. But they persist because they know that their research is important and useful and may even radically change our views. For example, Lisa Diamond has been studying sexual fluidity for quite some time. And you're going to watch her talk about her research about, for many individuals, about how... Starting over. Week 11, Chapter 10. Do you know what's sometimes very difficult but also very cool? Being a sex researcher. I love what I study, primarily sexual satisfaction, sexual intimacy, and sexual self-disclosure. But a lot of people think those topics are better left unstudied. They're too private, they're too personal, and what kind of weirdo pervert are you for trying to get people to tell you how much they masturbate, or whether they orgasm regularly, or how satisfied they are with their casual sex partner? But the thing is, knowledge is useful, especially when it comes to things that are so private and so personal that they often aren't talked about very much, even with close friends or one's own sexual partner. And even more so when these private, personal things are so important to us. Very few people would happily forego all sexual contact for the rest of their lives. Why not? Because we are driven to experience affection and closeness with others. We are driven to seek satisfaction sexually. We are sexual beings, and not knowing about how sex works or what works for which people or which people have which sexual problems, this is a problem. So you're going to watch some videos and read about some of the earliest sexuality researchers who were trying to answer these questions and others at a much more conservative time in history, when homosexuality was still considered a mental disorder and premarital sex was completely unacceptable. These researchers were absolutely pioneers, and they faced considerable difficulties while trying to study the things that they thought were important. There are still pioneers today studying difficult topics that again seem too personal or too sensitive for many people in the public, and even for some other researchers. But they persist because they know that their research is important and useful and may even radically change our views. For example, Lisa Diamond has been studying sexual fluidity for quite some time, and you're going to watch her talk about her research about how for many people, sexual orientation and sexual attractions are fluid. That is, they change. Yes, there are people who are 100% heterosexual and who have only ever been attracted to people of the opposite sex. And there are those who are 100% homosexual who have only ever been attracted to those of the same sex. But there are plenty of people somewhere in between, and women are more likely to demonstrate this sexual fluidity than men. So why do I consider her research pioneering? Well, consider that a lot of individuals believe that gays and lesbians deserve not to be discriminated against because they were born that way. There's a lot of research to suggest that homosexuality is genetic and that you can't change someone's sexual orientation. So just as you can't change skin color, if you can't change sexual orientation, then it's definitely inappropriate to discriminate against someone because they're gay or lesbian. But the thing is, Lisa Diamond's research says, yes, some people are born that way, but many aren't. And regardless of whether someone is 100% gay or only 75% gay, they shouldn't be subject to any sort of discrimination. Whether you're born gay or you choose to be gay, or at some point in life you simply fall in love with someone of the same sex, having never even remotely considered that you could be gay, it shouldn't matter. And that's really interesting and somewhat of a brave position to take, given that a lot of LGBT activists have fought very hard to have the idea accepted that some people are simply born gay. Week 12, sex. This week is a selection of interesting topics related to sexuality. Some of these are topics that I've personally studied, friends with benefits, faking orgasms, and some are topics that I simply find really interesting, like sexual frequency and gender and polyamory. I'll just say a few words about the friends with benefits research because that was actually with an honors student here at SMU. Maybe you're not a psychology major, or maybe you are, but the thought of doing an honors thesis hasn't really crossed your mind. Regardless, it's interesting to think that even at this point in your academic career, you could actually do research that matters. The data that my student and I collected was actually the basis for a paper that we wrote, and it's been published in the Canadian Journal of Human Sexuality. And while the focus of that paper was different than the student's thesis, and even from what you'll read about in the upcoming lecture, it was still the data that he and I collected for his honors thesis. So he was ultimately interested in looking at whether sexual satisfaction differed in friends with benefits relationships from romantic relationships. Spoiler, didn't really matter much, the difference there. But because we had collected the gender for all our participants, we were able to also compare males and females. So when I first taught this course, I asked him to prepare some slides on gender and friends with benefits, and he lectured on the topic. To do the analyses, though, we actually had to exclude some people, and you might find this kind of interesting. So basically, in order to be able to interpret the results easily, we excluded people who did not identify their gender, so they didn't check off male or female, or who indicated a gender other than male or female. We allowed participants to write in an other option, and a minority identified themselves as genderqueer, bigender, agender, things like that. But there weren't enough of these individuals to compare them to males and females, so we removed them from the analysis to simplify things. Now, there are lots of cases in research where someone's gender shouldn't matter, and so you wouldn't remove them regardless of what gender they identify as. But when we're talking about sex, and specifically casual sex, we know that in this area there are both persistent gender stereotypes and real gender differences supported by research. So this is just something you need to be aware of when you're doing research so that you can be sure that when you do interpret the results, they make sense. In our case, we specifically wanted to compare men's and women's experiences with friends with benefits, so we needed to make sure that our groups were comprised of only those who identify as one of those two genders. Week 13, chapter 13-14. This is the last week of class. Woohoo! I'm happy you've made it thus far and have been watching these videos and working your way through the lectures. This last week is a short one with just the one lecture about gender and health, and I'll try to keep this video short too. I will say it's hard to keep these videos short as I just want to keep talking about the material, but hopefully you found them interesting and helpful in setting the scene for the upcoming lecture material. Certainly feel free to let me know what you thought of these little videos or of the lectures or any aspect of the course in the post-course evaluation if you want it to be anonymous, or simply just send me an email. So health. You may not have actually ever thought about how your gender influences your health, but it does. This is one of those times where biology does make a difference. Males and females have different internal and external genitalia, and they have different levels of different hormones circulating through their bodies. This is obviously going to have at least some impact on health. But there are still some external influences as well. For example, what's considered desirable for a woman's body shape is heavily influenced by culture and society, and this influences women to diet and to develop eating disorders, all of which are related to health. But health isn't just physical, it's also mental. Your body might be working perfectly, but maybe you struggle with depression or anxiety, or simply have difficulty coping with stress. These are all aspects of health as well, and we know there are some gender differences here too. When you're going through the section on stress and coping, I really want to challenge you to think about your own coping mechanisms. Are you simply using the strategies for your gender because that's what you think you should be doing? Or are you choosing a coping strategy based on the stressful situation that you find yourself in? Hint, the latter is the better option. I point this out because, as you know so well by now, men are often forced by society to be independent, and especially during times of stress. They're taught to man up and deal with the problems themselves. They aren't encouraged to seek emotional support. And to a much lesser degree, women are sometimes encouraged to simply vent about their problems, but not to be assertive in trying to fix things. The expectation is often that for women, simply having a good talk or a good cry will be sufficient, but sometimes you actually have to go and fix the problem. It would be ideal if both men and women were free to adopt whatever coping strategy was actually the most helpful in that situation. But until society has done away with all gender stereotypes, that's unlikely to happen. And frankly, that's also unlikely to happen, having no more gender stereotypes or gender roles or differential gender socialization. And I know that sounds pessimistic, but that's just my opinion right now.